Good evening, folks. It's 6 p.m. and we are uncharacteristically going to start on time. I want to welcome our distinguished speaker, Yanis Varoufakis, to the New School, and he will be on the stage shortly. I want to welcome this audience, this remarkably large audience, the people who are here, as well as those who will see it online. And I want to thank the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis, SEPA, for arranging this incredibly timely discussion on the future of capitalism. We live in an era in which shallowness is celebrated as an ideal, in which shouting is considered a form of discussion, and the repetition of falsehoods trumps considered judgment. I want to remind you instead, and turn our attention instead to the idea of tradition. Not tradition in the sense of practices which are hidebound and need to give way, but rather to the tradition of critical inquiry. Now, I know I sound old when I say that, tradition and critical inquiry, but that's my job, and I believe in it. Today's lecture is part of the Halberner lecture series arranged by SEPA. And these lectures characteristically provide a critical perspective on the world in which we live. Professor Varoufakis' talk will be an eminent example of this approach, since its subject is the future of capitalism. Now, the lecture series is named after Robert Halberner, and I want to say a little bit about this extraordinary man. His introduction to economics, The Worldly Philosophers, is, in my opinion, still the best way to understand the range and complexity of economic thought. It reminds us of how ideas rise and fall and perhaps rise again. And that is part of the political and analytical debate that goes on about capitalism and how to understand it. He was a man who, in 1980, wrote a book called Capitalism For and Against, at a time when the Reagan-Thatcher revolution was in its heat. And that was a sign of his ability to think through things, to take positions that he thought were correct without an attempt to see if they were popular or whether they were appropriate to the times. And that's why his work is indeed timeless. His approach to economics is built into the DNA of the economics department, which is this part which is where SEPA is located. But I want to say a little bit also about the New School, which has always been and continues to be a place for progressive and critical thought. The New School for Social Research harks back to its founding in 1919 by progressive thinkers such as Charles Beard, Thorstein Veblen, John Dewey, and others. Charles Beard, as we know, resigned his professorship at Columbia University in 1917 after the university imposed a loyalty oath to the United States upon the entire faculty and student body. And it fired several professors in the process. He left, and 2 years later helped found the New School, which was now the New School for Social Research. In the 1930s, the New School for Social Research became a haven for scholars fleeing fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and subsequently occupied France. And there are so many eminent names that one can only just mention a few random ones: Erich Fromm, Hannah Arendt, Hans Jonas, and Adolf Loh. Loh was also my mentor at the New School, as was Bob Halberner. Parsons School of Art and Design is a premier institution of its sort in the country, and it emphasizes the critical thinking, emphasizes the application of critical thinking to art, architecture, and global environments. Eugene Lang College provides an environment in which undergraduates are taught to think independently, to engage with original texts, and learn how to argue a position and even to listen, an art which is entirely lost these days, at least if you listen to the political discourse. The New School for Public Engagement, which spans creative writing, media studies, and the application of ideas to social practice and social change. And the College of Performing Arts, which is nationally and internationally renowned for its training in music and drama. What binds all of these different aspects of the New School is the notion that scholarship can and should change the world. Now, I remind you that Keynes spoke here when he was trying to get his ideas into practice and currency at a time when the future of capitalism was precisely the issue on the agenda in the Great Depression. Bernie Sanders, I discovered, was a graduate student in the New School for Social Research in sociology, but then he decided to go on to better things. So I can't think of a better place to welcome our guest, who has put his scholarship precisely to the task that binds us all, to analyze the world critically and then to step forward to try to change it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This day has been long in planning. Welcome to our audience here. Welcome to our audience in the overflow room. I understand there's about 900 people here. We also have hundreds of people listening to us online. For you, those of you on the computer, you can Twitter your questions to us at hashtag YanisTNS. So my name is Teresa Ghilarducci. I'm a professor of economics here, and I'm the director of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis that Anwar graciously talked about. It is my pleasure to also welcome you to this year's Robert Heilbronner Memorial Lecture. Each year, the center, along with the faculty of the economics department, selects a distinguished economist who shares our goal, SEPA's goal, of embedding critical economic thinking into mainstream policymaker. I also want to give a shout out to our benefactor, Bernard Schwartz, who made a lot of money in industry. He sold many satellites, and in his retirement, he's dedicating those profits, some of those profits, to us because he shares our goals of making the global economy more stable, to be sure, but also much more just and equal. Thank you, Bernard. I especially want to thank and give a shout out to our New School students, the ones that are here in the room who may be our current students, those of you who may be our former students, and all of our students out there. I know I speak for all the faculty when I say that we are grateful to you. We are grateful for the pleasure that you give us, for the privilege that we have in teaching you and helping you learn, and how much we learn from you every day and every year. We know that you are fighting very hard for the knowledge that you need. We know that you're putting yourself, many of you, into financial debt because you share the institution's goal for a more just and a more peaceful planet. It is my pleasure now to introduce our speaker, Professor Yanis Varoufakis. He came to our attention many years ago with his fresh take on microeconomics. You probably didn't know that. He blew up that staid field in a textbook on game theory. It's still used as a microeconomics textbook. He has a distinguished economic career, academic career. He earned his PhD from the University of Essex in 1987. And he has published in numerous places, scholarly places. His books are many. One of them is called The Golden Minotaur, Modern Political Economics, Making Sense of the Post-2008 World. Most recently, he has written a book. It's for sale in the lobby, and it's called, evocatively, And the Weak Suffer, What They Must, ? Europe's Crisis and America's Economic Future. Professor Varoufakis was elected to the Greek Parliament in 2015, and he quickly became Greece's finance minister during the Greek debt crisis. He forcefully and eloquently articulated the intellectual, the political, and practical case against austerity. He fought for that in Greece, for Europe, and it turns out, I think because of the tenor of the current political campaign, the campaign for President of the United States, in our country as well. He has often considered himself and stated to the press that he's a politician only by necessity, not by choice. After leading his country's negotiations with the Troika, the International Monetary Fund, the European Community, and the European Central Bank, he resigned in refusal to sign a third bailout loan, a deal he described as one that was designed to fail. In February 2016, just a few months ago, Professor Varoufakis launched a pan-European political movement in Berlin. And that movement is calling for the democracy of Europe and for disintegrating the European Union. Please welcome Professor Yanis Varoufakis.
Good evening. It is a great pleasure to be back in a university, and not any university, but to be back at a new school. Because a new school is one of the very few bastions of subversive thinking in economics. And these days, unless you're subversive in the way you think about economics, you're not thinking about economics, you're thinking about a wonderful, aesthetically pleasing model whose utility comes from having absolutely nothing to do with really existing capitalism. So congratulations to the good people of New School for maintaining a commitment to remaining in connection with really existing capitalism and having something useful to say about this. This, I've been told, is a lecture in honor of Robert Heilbronner. Anwar before said a few words about Robert and about his wonderful work, and especially the worldly philosophers, which I will have to second the point that it remains a brilliant introduction to economic thinking. Because what Robert brought to us was this magnificent combination of economic history and history of economic thought. Now, in any other university in this state, on this continent, probably on this planet, this kind of thinking is considered to be woolly and redolent of an inability to be technical, to be scientific about economics. The view everywhere else except for the New School and another 2 or 3 places around the world is that take physics. Why would a good physicist waste time writing and researching and teaching about the history of physics? The history of physics is full of error. Just read Aristotle's Physics. It's just pathetically inaccurate. It's a very interesting story of a major fallacy. Yeah? But if you're a physicist, why would you want to engage? It's something you do when you are about 93. Just before you kick the bucket, you may read Aristotle and write about your reminiscences of yourself as a young physicist in the relation to the error of Aristotle. Of course, the difference is that economics is not a science. At least it is not a natural science. And the profound difference, I'm not going to give a lecture on this, but unlike in physics, where the latest textbook is more or less guaranteed to be more knowledgeable about nature than a textbook of 20, 30, 300, 3,000 years ago, in economics, we tend to forget to lose truths that previous generations understood better. In a sense, if you go back 30 years, the consensus on what was the essence of capitalism was much closer to today's capitalism than the latest textbook taught at Columbia, at New York University, at the University of Sussex, wherever. And this is a very interesting phenomenon, but it's not a phenomenon that we should be looking at today. I just had to mention it because Heilbronner was committed to the idea that the only way of approaching economics was through this combination of the history of economic thought, of economic history, and analytics, but all together. So I'm very pleased to be delivering a talk in his honor, and especially in this magnificent place. Now, what I wanted to talk about today was the present and the future of capitalism and democracy. The problem in today's world is that one needs, before one says anything sensible about capitalism and democracy, we need to return to basics, don't we? What do we mean by capitalism? What do we mean by democracy? I talk to financiers all the time. I talk to journalists all the time. If you ask them what capitalism is, they are lost. They assume that they know, but if you push them, they will end up regurgitating the story about markets, a system of markets, as if capitalism is all about markets. And if you ask them about democracy, then they are completely lost, utterly lost. So let's just spend a few moments contemplating those two concepts. And I'll begin with democracy. Even though I'm an economist, my recent experiences lead me towards grappling with democracy before I go into the concept of capitalism. And let me just share part of this recent experience in the first meeting of Europe's finance ministers, where I was representing Greece as its finance minister. I was a rookie. It was my first meeting, and as a rookie, I was afforded the floor to begin participating, presenting to the other finance ministers my agenda, the agenda of our government, what it is that we came to Brussels with in terms of proposals and predisposition. And I try to be, given my reputation as the finance minister of the radical left-wing government of Greece, of a country whose state was bankrupt and in debt to the tune of $400 billion, I try to be moderate. So I began by explaining that I understand that they were quite peeved that I was there, that I was a living and breathing inconvenience, that they would much rather the other lot had won the election. And I tried to show a degree of understanding towards that. And I said to them, the only reason why I'm here is because of the Great Depression of Greece. Greece went bankrupt in 2010, and you lot, I didn't say you lot, but that's what I meant, together with the Greek ruling elites, decided to cover that bankruptcy up by extending to the Greek state the largest loan in human history under conditions that ensured, with mathematical precision, the shrinkage of our GDP by 28%. 28%, Steinbeck, the Grapes of Wrath, that kind of magnitude and dimension. Yeah? And the people of Greece decided to send somebody like me to say to you, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to extend and pretend. We're not going to take another loan to pretend that we are repaying our debts under conditions that will continue to shrink our income and to sink our country deeper and deeper into depression. Indeed, come to think of it, it took a Great Depression to bring to power a radical left-wing Minister of Finance who went to the Eurogroup to present them something that would normally come out of the mouth of a Wall Street bankruptcy lawyer. That if the debt is unsustainable, it makes no sense to pretend that it is sustainable, that you need to restructure it, and you need to have a rethink about the loan agreement. This is what bankruptcy lawyers do in downtown here every day. They restructure corporate loans, municipality loans, all sorts of loans that need to be restructured so that the creditors can get something back. Amartya Sen, you may have heard of him, when we met some time ago, he said, "You had a very difficult time, didn't you?" I said, "Yes, I know, Amartya." He said, "You must have been the only person to have been negotiating that with creditors that did not want their money back." Because creditors want to restructure your debt. Now, what did I experience? And why is this my introduction to the concept of democracy? Okay, first meeting, I'm trying to be moderate. So I say, "Dear colleagues, I'm here to participate with you in a project, a joint project of rebooting the Greek economy, to bring about the recovery which is necessary to produce the incomes from which you will get your money back. I understand that there is an existing program that the previous governments have signed up to. And because of the principle that the state has a certain degree of continuity, it's not that we elect a new government and we start from year zero. We're not Pol Pot. But there is also another principle, the principle of democracy. We were elected on a mandate to challenge this program. So what happens in a democratic European Union when you have two principles, continuity and democracy, clashing? We sit down and we establish common ground. We compromise. And I thought that that would be the most moderate way with which to start a beautiful friendship with my new colleagues. I didn't get a chance to put the period, the full stop to my sentence. Wolfgang Schäuble puts his hands up. Actually, you don't put, what you do is you take a name tag and you stand it on its head. That's what you do in the Eurogroup. Bang. One sentence. Elections cannot be allowed to change the economic policies applied to Greece. Then I took my name tag and stood it on its head. Having regained the floor, I said, "This is a great gift to the Chinese Communist Party because they believe exactly the same thing." You see, this is, if you want, my introduction to the ways in which the neoliberal agenda that has emerged out of the second post-war phase of global capitalism has undermined the narrative of the ruling elites regarding democracy. Now they are reaching a point of having no scruples about declaring democracy null and void. No longer do they feel even the need to appropriate the mantra of democracy for propaganda purposes. Now they are, effectively, it's the greatest vindication of Lee Kuan Yew, of Deng Xiaoping. The idea that efficiency has replaced the need to consult voters. This is very interesting. And I believe that we will understand a lot about the future of capitalism by delving a little bit more into it. But now let's go a long way back into the past. Democracy, like all bad things, began in Athens. Let me remind you that the Cold War began in Athens. It didn't begin in Berlin. The Cold War began December 1944 in the streets of Athens, 6 months before we had any of the antagonisms between the Soviet Union and the Allies in Berlin. The Euro crisis began in Athens. And of course, democracy began in Athens. There's something about the place. I don't know what it is. Now, it is usually, and for good reason, said that democracy in ancient Athens was so severely circumscribed by racism and by sexism, by the exclusion of the metics. The metics were the migrants, the foreigners, of course, the slaves, and women. But it would be a mistake, and I think Ellen Wood has made a very good case for this. It would be a mistake to dismiss ancient Athenian democracy on the basis of whom it excluded. It is much more interesting to look at ancient Athenian democracy on the basis of whom it included. Because the 70 or so years, 70, 75 years, during which this fragile flower flourished before it was trampled by the Macedonians, later by the Romans, and so on. During those 70, 75 years, we had a very interesting regime in Athens, in which the majority ruled, the majority being the poor, the working poor citizens, men, but nevertheless working poor. Now, all the great and good ancient Athenians, whose names still resonate, hated democracy. Plato was a committed anti-democrat. Aristotle was not so committed, but he was also an anti-democrat. And he actually gave the most interesting definition of democracy. It is a constitution in which the poor and the free, courtesy of being in the majority, control the government. So democracy is a highly politicized, very left-wing concept, if Aristotle is to be believed. A system of governance in which power lies with the poor, who happen to be the majority. This was indeed only possible because of scale being such that it permitted for direct decision-making. And to the extent that democracy was also interwoven with another concept, a much less well-known concept, which to me is or ought to be highly significant. I'll pronounce it in Greek. It's isigoria. The concept of isigoria, which what it means is the right to have your views listened to on their merit, independently of who is speaking the words articulating the view, independently of whether the person who is speaking the words that articulate that view is rich, poor, articulate, rhetorically accomplished, or inarticulate. This is very interesting, so much so that if you were too articulate as in your rhetoric, you got ostracized. Ostracized meant that citizens, during the end of the last final stages of the assembly, they would take an ostraco, which was a shell, a seashell, and write a name of the person that they wanted to expel from the city for being too articulate, too influential, therefore subverting isigoria, stopping those who were less articulate from having their views listened and judged on their merit, not on how beautifully and flowery their speech was. They went to such extremes. And indeed, in the final stage of degenerate Athens, after the end of the Peloponnesian War and the defeat of the tyrants, they went so far as to argue against elections. Elections are deeply undemocratic towards the end of the Athenian democratic period. Why? Because through competition, they create a false dynamic, a competitiveness which usurps the essence of the exchange of ideas, and they replaced elections with random draws, which is where the jury system comes from, or the concept of it. So, anyway, what does our democracy today have to do with this? Nothing. The reason, of course, it's got nothing is because our liberal democracies come from a completely different setup, a different mode of production, as Marx would say. In a sense, they hark back to the Magna Carta, to the notion of rights, Now, the Magna Carta, of course, was the rights of the barons. It wasn't the rights of the slaves, it wasn't the rights of the peasants. It was the rights of the barons to have peasants and slaves, and not to have them poached by the king. So it was a contract between the barons and the king, limiting the power of the king over the barons, so the barons could have unlimited power over the plebs. This is the beginning. It was a social contract between the lords and the monarch. And then with commodification, the first stage of the international trade route building dynamic that led eventually to the Industrial Revolution and to fully fledged commodification in the form of capitalism. You had the merchants that had raw economic power, but no political power. They were the dirty merchants that no aristocrat wanted to be seen dead with them. And they eventually converted their economic power into political power through getting organized and forcing themselves upon the aristocrats and the king. Eventually, you had the proletariat after the enclosures beginning to organize in the 19th century, and trades unions, organized labor, began to demand its own say, and therefore the modern state emerged as a mechanism for regulating class conflicts. And this is how government proceeded from the narrative of rights to the narrative of liberal democracy. Don't forget that even enlightened liberals like John Stuart Mill were profoundly anti-democratic, profoundly skeptical of the process of parliamentary democracy, for instance. So what we take for granted today, or until recently, what we took for granted, that capitalism and liberal democracy go hand in hand, that they are natural bedfellows. This is a very recent phenomenon. And unless we approach it in the way that Robert Heilbronner, amongst others, recommended, that is, through a study, simultaneous study of economic history, the history of commodification, in a sense, the history of capitalism, the evolution of the conflict between social relations of production and technologies, on the one hand, and, on the other hand, the evolution of our ideas about the world that is being shaped by this process, by this historical evolutionary process, unless we study the past, the present, and potentialities for the future through this prism, we have no chance of using a mathematized approach in order to secure any handle on the reality in which we find ourselves. So the classics of economic theory were all part and parcel of this mindset. Whether you agree or disagree with them, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, all the way to Schumpeter, they tried to stay faithful to this approach. But at the very same time, the same process of commodification that these great economic thinkers were focusing upon produced the imperative for an ideological cover for commodification. And whereas in the Middle Ages, the ideological cover came in the form of religion, in the era of capitalism, it took the form of the illusion of an apolitical, ahistorical, mathematicized economic theory. And exactly the same, in exactly the same way that commodification, the march of, if you want, exchange value against experiential or use value, the march of the commodity that takes over all goods and commodifies them, whether they are things you can eat and touch or intangibles like the genome of certain plants, species, at some point human beings. In exactly the same way that this inexorable march proceeded, in the sphere of social theory, the mathematized, apolitical, ahistorical model proceeded. But the beauty of the human intellect is that the truth will always manifest itself, even in the most abstracted theoretical construct. So just for one moment, allow me to say a few words about Kenneth Arrow. Just a few moments. Now, Kenneth Arrow, in the mindset of those of us who are of this tradition, let me not explain what this tradition is. I'm at the new school, I don't have to do it. Is somebody who is on the other side, on the dark side of the force. He's somebody who has indulged for years, for decades, this attempt to discover the truth about economic systems in its mathematical structure. And yet, because he has an honest intellect, his impossibility theorem led him to a magnificent discovery that if you want to stay coherent logically and analytically and to be mathematically correct, you have to come to the conclusion that it is impossible to take the preferences, desires, predispositions of individuals and consistently to manufacture out of them a notion, a well-defined understanding of the common will. Now, the beauty of this is that it has two interpretations. One is that if there can be no well-defined notion of the common will, then clearly no state can be justified. Because if there is no well-defined notion of the common will, what on earth is the state serving? Except vested interests. That's the libertarian view, the Hayekian view, if you want. But this is one interpretation. It's an interpretation which is utterly inconsistent with capitalism. Because capitalism without the state is like Christianity without hell. It doesn't work. Capitalism would not have been created without state brutish force, the enclosures that created the working class, the proletariat, that commodified land, that commodified even capital, would not have been possible without the state. And the state could not wither away, to use a Marxian expression, while capitalism needs to be replenished through capital accumulation, because without the state regulating capital accumulation, capital runs out of steam. So what's the other interpretation of Kenneth Arrow's impossibility theorem? It is that there can be no technical solution to the problem of finding out what we want using as input information, perfect information, of what each one of us desires, which is the best vindication of democracy. Because democracy is not what positive political science teaches, a mechanism from converting private political preferences into what society wants politically. Democracy is dialectic. So Socrates is dialectic, ancient Athenian dialectic, Hegelian dialectic. I'm sitting here, I'm discussing with you, we disagree, and when we leave the room, neither of us are the same persons that entered the room. This conversation has taken a part of you and infused it in my thinking, and has taken a part of me and has infused it in your thinking. And this process is, by definition, dialectical in the sense that it is indeterminate. And therefore, democracy is a system, as my newly acquired wonderful friend Brian Eno said, it's a system for people who are not sure about what they think. And they certainly are not sure about what is good for society. But through arguing, through acting, through praxis, together, they can create that which did not exist, the impossibility theorem. So there is no problem with the mathematics of the mainstream school of economics. The mathematics is beautiful. And if you have a degree of sensitivity in the way you read it, you can acquire wonderful truths out of it. But one truth that you will never acquire, or actually two truths you will never acquire, is firstly the truth about capitalism, because There cannot exist capitalism inside a system of equations. This is where David Laban would disagree with me. And secondly, the truth about democracy. Because both are highly indeterminate processes. The only reason why we have this epic struggle in the context of capitalism, between capital and labor, a struggle that can never be resolved as long as capitalism is alive and kicking as a mode of production, is because capital has an ironclad determination and objective and imperative to crush labor, to commodify labor, to cheapen labor, to effectively take over labor. Ideally, the capitalists would like to take your labor away from you and not to have to deal with you. But because the capitalists cannot do that, commodification can never be complete. The fact that commodification can never be complete is what gives value to commodities. And the more successful capitalism is at commodifying human beings, the greater the crisis of capitalism. That is, if you want, a Shakespearean, Sophocles-like or Euripides-like tragedy where the actors, capital and labor, within this game of capitalism are condemned never to find equilibrium. It is a profoundly, deeply disequilibrium process. And this epic struggle converts into an epic struggle about democracy. If you think about the American Constitution, if you read the Federalist Papers, and I'm sure you've all read them, the whole point about the American Constitution was how to deprive the demos of democracy. How to make sure, through representative democracy, that the hoi polloi, the plebs, are kept away from the levers of political power, but they lent their legitimacy, or they lent legitimacy to political power through consent, through manufacturing their consent. It is abundantly clear, and it is said so explicitly. Alexander Hamilton, for instance. So democracy was to be used in name in order to be breached in substance. The idea of democracy was essential in the regulation of capitalism. It was essential in ameliorating the crisis of capitalism and the distribution of the burdens of the crisis of capitalism, as long as it never went so far as to render the demos ruling, as long as the demos was always kept out of the democratic process. Now, the experience I had in the Eurogroup is simply the limiting case of this. I just happened, completely accidentally, to land in that position of the finance minister of Greece. And I had the wonderful experience of actually having been told this. For the first time in my life, you will understand this as academics, I didn't have to theorize. They told me. They told me. Let me give you another example, just an anecdote, which I think is my favorite, absolute favorite. I don't know whether you feel the same way as me, but even though most people fall down laughing when I say this, I'm insecure deep down. I feel a certain degree of even intellectual insecurity. I may say things forcefully and believe what I say. For instance, the Greek fiscal consolidation program, I spent years lambasting, writing articles about it, doing econometric analysis about it. But deep down in me, there is still the little boy who would like to think that the adults know what they're doing. That the good people at the IMF, who have a lot more power than I did as a Minister of Finance of a bankrupt state, in the end knew what they were doing. Something deep inside me, even though I never believed it, hoped that that might be the case. So, first time I had a long sequence of negotiations with the good people from the IMF. Tedious, 10 hours with aides, with various committees, and looking at the debt sustainability analysis, and arguing about multipliers and about elasticities. Boring. The good part happened after midnight, over a glass of whiskey in the lobby of a hotel in Brussels with a top-notch person of that institution, whose name will remain unsaid. You know who it is. I didn't tell you who it is, but you know who it is. Anyway, so after this long day, and after I had killed myself to try to explain to these people why this program is impossible to bear fruit, that the numbers just don't add up, I heard her say, Yanis, of course you're right. This program can't work. I thought, oh no. The adults don't know what they're doing. But then immediately, I was told something else as well. But you must understand, we have invested so much of our political capital in this program that you must accept it in order to remain credible. Okay? Let me now add to this something that another person residing in this country, who actually was really wonderful to me during the difficult time of negotiations, and I really mean this. He contacted me, he called me. I nearly fainted when I heard his name on the phone, that he wanted to help me. I said to him, are you sure you want to help me? He said, yes, and he gave me very good reasons, anti-austerity reasons. And I said, Larry, do you realize that in my previous book, The Global Minotaur, I'm sure you haven't read it. He said, no, I haven't. I said, that figures, because in that book, I keep referring to you as the Prince of Darkness. And he said, at least you're referring to me as a prince. So anyway, when first time we met at another hotel lobby in DC, we were having this long discussion about, again, fiscal targets, tax rates, VAT, multipliers, structural reforms, blah, blah, blah. And I could see that his eyes were glazing over. At some point, he had enough of this conversation, and he wanted to end it and ask me a question. He said, before we continue, so that I know to what extent I can help you and what kind of help I should be giving you. And he was very helpful, I mean that, seriously. He understood that what was happening in Greece was simply prolonging secular stagnation, which is his term, for the great slow-burning recession that we have been stuck in since 2008, here in the United States, in Europe, globally. He had a question for me to find out what kind of guy I was and the extent to which I could be helped. He said, Yanis, you have to make a very important choice, a personal choice. This is a personal, moral choice. I said, okay. He said, you can choose to be an outsider. You can choose to be somebody who speaks truth to power, who tells the truth, who talks to people in the new school. He didn't mean that. He didn't say that, but he could have said that. And that will make you feel good. And you are going to have a pretty good profile, but you will be jettisoned by the political system. Or you can choose to be an insider. If you choose to be an insider, then you'll be given a modicum of power to stay within the system and to make some marginal change within. But the golden rule of the insider is that you never speak out against other insiders outside. So make your choice. Now, it's clear what choice I made. Yeah? No, but I think that is important because these are invariant truths about political power in capitalism. The reason, of course, is that the transformation of capitalism from the 19th century authoritarian regimes that afforded rights to property to those who had it and disdained the notion even of elections, to the idea that we all live in democracies and democracy is at one with capitalism. This transformation took place only while, or actually after, power shifted from the political sphere to the economic sphere. It's just like feminization of professions. In exactly the same way that when particular professions like teaching, like nursing, like doctors, like judges in Greece, you may be interested to know, when women grow in numbers within these professions, the remuneration of those professions and the social status of these professions go down. In exactly the same way, for 100 years now, power has been shifting from the political sphere to the economic sphere, which is a democracy-free zone. And only after power left the political sphere was the political sphere democratized. But very soon after that, there was the crisis of capitalism after 1971, the Nixon shock, the passage from the first post-war phase to the second post-war phase, and then suddenly, even that political sphere was set aside with rule-bound codes of decision-making. In the European Union in particular, this has become extremely manifest. If you look at what has happened in Europe in the last 30 years, you will see that we have democratic states with functioning parliaments, with functioning constitutions, but all the important decisions have been moved to the democracy-free zone of the European Union. And I get very annoyed when I hear people saying that there is a democratic deficit in the European Union. There is no democratic deficit. It's like saying that there is an oxygen deficit on the moon. There is no oxygen deficit on the moon. There is no oxygen. When in the last Eurogroup meeting I said to my colleagues that the ultimatum they were giving us was such that it was impossible for us either to accept or to reject it. Because they were telling us that if we reject it, it's casus belli with Europe, which is a bit strange because I thought we were part of Europe. How can you be at war with yourself? Anyway, so we didn't have a mandate to declare war against Europe. On the other hand, we didn't have a mandate. I didn't have a mandate to sign a loan agreement whose numbers did not add up. And it was not just my judgment that they didn't add up. It was also the judgment of people like Wolfgang Schäuble, Christine Lagarde, President Draghi of the ECB. In bilateral discussions, they all agreed that these numbers didn't add up, but they wanted me to accept them for my credibility, right? Remember? And at that point, what I said to them was, what we decided, the Prime Minister and our small team, the war cabinet as we called it, we're going to put it to the Greek people. And you can campaign if you want. You can come to Greece and campaign in favor of your proposal. We will campaign against it, and it's up to the Greek people, isn't it? At that point, a number of finance ministers took the floor and looked at me in the eye, incensed, and asked me a very difficult question. You realize that you are putting your people in a difficult situation of having to make a pivotal decision on complicated matters? I said, yes, it's called democracy. It's a very odd system. It's a terrible system. It's an awful system. But as Churchill said, it's the best of all alternatives, right? Do you have a better way of doing it? Of course they had. Every single decision they made in there, firstly, they never consulted anyone about. Secondly, they themselves were not consulted. Their aides reached those decisions behind closed door and then told the ministers. The ministers didn't even understand what they were agreeing to. And thirdly, they never even announced it. It's not just that the populations were presented with a fait accompli. They still don't know what has been decided 6 years ago on their behalf and implemented. So we see that the golden era of the post-war capitalist order, the Bretton Woods system, which was an aberration. It was a system that was created by new dealers who'd experienced in their bones the trials and tribulations of the Great Depression, and who were determined not to see this happen again, who understood probably not the epic struggle between labor and capital, but at least the epic struggle to recycle surpluses and deficits in complex economies that looked not like general equilibrium models, but closer to something like that Michal Kalecki and John Maynard Keynes would have described. They understood that unless there was political surplus recycling at the global level, it was impossible to maintain fixed exchange rates and therefore to maintain a modicum of stability and an image of civilization for capitalism. It is not, I think, without meaning that Harry Dexter White ensured that in the Bretton Woods Conference, not one banker was allowed to attend. But that system was predicated upon American imperialism as well, the Cold War, and the capacity of the United States to do the surplus recycling, to recycle its own surplus. The moment the United States lost its surplus and slipped into a deficit, the pressing question emerged, so how does the United States superpower maintain its hegemony now that it's no longer in surplus? Every other time in history, a mega power lost its surplus, collapsed. In the United States, we had a magnificent phenomenon of increased hegemony on the foundation of increased deficits. I think that the trick to achieving that was what Paul Volcker said in a discussion with Henry Kissinger in 1970. When Henry Kissinger asked him the question, that was before his before moving to the State Department, when he was still the National Security Advisor. He asked Volcker, how can we maintain our hegemony now that we've lost our surplus? And the answer was, well, if we can't recycle our own surplus, we have to recycle everybody else's surpluses. And that, of course, was achieved through turning the United States of America into a huge vacuum cleaner that was sucking into American territory the net exports of Germany, of Japan, later of China, and paying for it by also sucking into Wall Street the profits of German, Dutch, Saudi Arabian, Japanese, and later Chinese capital, and therefore closing the loop. But what happens when a tsunami of capital flows into Wall Street every day? Bankers find a way of dividing and multiplying it, of financializing it. But to financialize it, some politicians in DC have to turn a blind eye to this. And some theorists must provide the legitimation for this. Call it efficient market hypothesis, call it international financial macroeconomics, taught in other universities. I hope you don't teach this rubbish here. And the result is a diminution of the link between even the semblance of liberal democracy with industrial capital, fixed capital formation, the conversion of companies like General Motors into financial instruments that produce some cars on the side. This whole magnificent edifice, of course, collapsed under its own hubris in 2008, and the world remains ever since in limbo. Its crisis, that is a crisis of realization, and the result of the fact that this recycling mechanism is severely broken down, leads China to creating in desperation bubbles in order to buy time for America and Europe to get their act together. But America and Europe are politically ungovernable. Here you have the White House vetoing the Congress and Congress vetoing the White House. In Europe, need I say more? Just put the words European economic governance together and you end up with a joke. And the world we live in is increasingly rudderless, in a constant, slow-burning recession, while at the very, very same time, the increasing concentration in the IT sector is creating the new technologies that will do that which the left has failed to do. Overthrow capitalism. It is really very simple. The moment machines pass the Turing test properly, and you pick up the phone and you do not know whether the person that you are talking to is a human being or a machine. The moment we are going to have 3D printers operating as public utilities, you can send anything, any blueprint to it, and it can print from one pin to a motorcycle or to a car. The moment that this happens, we have not just a process of Schumpeterian creative destruction, but we have a process where economies of scale and the whole logic of corporate capitalism collapses. And at that point, we have a major rupture that the political system, which has been completely depleted of any semblance of democracy, will not be able to regulate. At that point, humanity will be facing a juncture. We either move to a Star Trek-like utopia, where technology becomes our slaves, and we manage to utilize its wealth-creating capacity for the purpose of the common good, which will be democratically determined and not technologically, remember Arrow, or we're going to move towards a Matrix-like dystopia where humans, independently of where they are, the owners of these magnificent machines or the masses who are miserable and completely cut off productive society, will all become servants to the machines in exactly the same way that Mary Shelley described and Karl Marx followed in Das Kapital. The choice will depend on democratic politics. The choice is everyone's. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very good, really good, really good. Yanis, can you sit down? Hello. Thank you very much. You've met all of our expectations. You all have your note cards. You can start writing your questions, and our good folks here, our students, will collect them from you. Thank you. It is our pleasure to do something a little different this year. This is the second time we've done it, that we have pledged that every time we bring in a famous and engaging speaker, that our students get to speak. And so this is the second time that one of our students will follow our distinguished speaker. This student is Ebba Boye. She is a master's student now at the New School in the Department of Economics. She received her bachelor's degree in economics at the University of Oslo. Before coming to New York to study at the New School, she worked for a Norwegian think tank called Manifest. She was the vice president of the Socialist Youth of Norway, and she was a coordinator for the Norwegian Social Forum. Ebba has written and researched the inequalities embedded in the Norwegian housing market and the privatization, the commodification of the Norwegian welfare state. Please please join me in welcoming Ebba Boye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yanis. I will start this talk by explaining where I come from. My background is from Norway, a tiny country in the outskirts of Europe, where the struggle to stay outside of the EU has been fought from the left against what we saw as a neoliberal project that would move our democracy to Brussels. With a coalition of farmers, unions, and the political left, and against the will of the political elites and the main media, the Norwegian people said no to the EU in 2 referendums in 1972 and 1994. So in many ways, I was looking at the unfolding of the Greek crisis from the outside. Norway was one of the countries that got rather quickly through the economic crisis. The policies of our socialist finance minister were directed at not only saving the banks, but also our jobs. By increasing public spending and giving the regions fresh resources, they could hire people to repair old school buildings and build new bicycle paths. Jobs were created directly, and the tax flow was secured. Of course, our oil money was also important, but not as important as people think. The political decision not to decrease taxes in times of crisis, but instead increase public spending, was much more central. And as the economy got back on its feet, the banks were able to pay back the bailout money. So in this respect, it was very interesting to follow what the media in Norway and also the rest of Europe were saying about what was happening in Greece. Article after article focused on how the Greek could blame themselves because they were so lazy. The reason for the crisis was apparently that the Greek people were not working long enough hours and that their pensions were too high. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel was pretty straightforward, claiming that we can't have a common currency where some are taking out more vacation than the others, and also claiming that the people of Greece, Spain, and Portugal can't take out their pensions earlier than the people of Germany. Well, I think it's time for some myth-busting. Because when I was reading the blog of Varoufakis at the time, and also articles by my colleagues in Norway, I was shocked to learn the truth, which was contrary to what we were being told by our mainstream media and politicians. Average working week in Greece was 41 hours, which is much more than what is normal in in Europe. Definitely more than it's normal in Norway. It is true that Greek women had a very low pension age. Though they continue to be productive with a lacking welfare state, someone has to take care of grandchildren and old parents. On the other hand, Greek men were on average staying in the working force longer than the German men. And it's the same story for Spain and Portugal. So why was the information we were getting from our political leaders and media some kind of fake storytelling? Especially because there are so many other stories that could have been told, like the one about how Greek private fortunes were estimated at about 700 billion euros, which was the double of the debt of the country. In other words, the issue was not a lack of national resources, but of public resources. Once the narrative of the lazy, overspending Greek had invaded our conscience, it was not hard for the politicians of Europe to tell us that the only remedy for this overspending was austerity. We had to show them that this kind of behavior was not acceptable. And what followed were demands for lower pensions, lower public salaries, a more flexible workforce, privatizations, and large cuts in public spending. And the economic theories you learn, many of the economic theories I learned in school would support this policy, claiming that in a deficit situation, you simply cut expenses and to get a balanced budget. And that a flexible workforce and lower salaries will enhance your competitiveness. Well, the problem is that that is a very bad theory. And it could never have been accepted if the people of Europe were not first convinced that there was a reason to punish these lazy Greeks. Especially in Norway, you would think that nobody would believe this narrative, because it is exactly our strong welfare state that is the most important factor behind our productivity. With high wages and job security, firms invest in both their employees and in machinery, and as a result, the Norwegian workforce is among the world's most productive. We might not be able to compete with the rest of the world on low prices. We can compete on the quality of the products we export. For most people in Europe, the dream about the European Union has always been about the countries of Europe pulling together and cooperating, creating growth and welfare for all its member nations. And there are definitely parts of the Union that serve that function. But in general, it has become competition and not cooperation that is the backbone of the EU. Countries compete for market shares, trying to lower prices by pushing down wages. And according to mainstream economic theory, this type of competition will increase our common welfare. The main driving force in the competition for cheaper labor has been Germany. To reduce unemployment, Germany promoted a deregulation of the labor market with the aim of reducing wages. And the following reforms were very effective. The number of fully employed Germans defined as working poor grew quickly. Work has become more precarious, there are more part-time jobs, mini-jobs, and millions work for the new temporary work agencies. It was so successful that in 2005, former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder boasted at the World Economic Forum that they had built up one of the best low-wage sectors in Europe. And these policies did have a positive impact on German competitiveness. At the end of the first decade of implementing the euro, the cost and price gap between Germany and Southern Europe amounted to some 25%. And as a consequence, the German trade surplus increased. A competition where the goal is to reduce wages is, of course, a competition that everyone will lose. It is a race to the bottom. What might have worked for German corporations, at least in the short run, cannot work if it spreads to the rest of Europe. If no countries experience wage increases, then who will buy all the goods that Germany wants to export? It's a policy for poverty and recession. Germany has started a process of unbalanced trade that is now causing the disintegration of Europe. At the same time, all the surplus capital was lent out to deficit countries. With banks competing for market shares, cheap credit led to a housing bubble in Spain, and in Greece, a corrupt government used foreign credit as a substitute for tax income. In 2009, German banks had acquired an outstanding credit of 816 billion euros, with Greece, Ireland, and Spain being among the main debtors. And when the crisis hit, the ECB acted quickly to save the German and French banks. A process was started where the Troika took over the Greek private and public debt. The banks and the European cash flow was secured. Now the Troika are using the creditor position to force Greece to co-opt the German model. But the large cuts in public budgets and the decrease in wages and pensions are causing a great retraction in demand. The result is thousands of stores and cafes having to close down from the lack of customers. 25% of Athens stores went bankrupt, changing the life on the streets dramatically. Youth unemployment is now over 50%, and it has been like that for years. What this means is that austerity measures have pushed a whole generation of young people out of the workforce. It's like the Troika were so afraid of Greek people being lazy on their nice beaches. They demanded policies that crunched the economy, and as a consequence, people were pushed out of the labor force. 30% of Greek population is now living below the poverty line, and these are people who used to live ordinary lives. The economic theory behind austerity policies is that the reduction in wages and prices will make the country competitive again. But the theory is failing catastrophically. And the reality is that the Greek people are forced into a situation where they are not allowed to work themselves out of the problems. Syriza's program for public spending and job creation was denied. Instead, it seems like they are supposed to starve themselves out of the crisis. It is a supply-driven theory, only focusing on how to reduce costs. It does not look at the demand side, and the failure is evident. Debt has, as a proportion of GDP, has increased from 130 to 170%. The story of the Greek tragedy is a story about a European Union built around the interests of the economic elites. And the story about Syriza shows how people are without democratic tools to decide the future of their own country. It shows that the EU will not allow the people of Greece to work themselves out of the depression. I do not share Varoufakis' hope that it is possible to democratize the European Union, because when the power is moved far away from the people, it is too easily hijacked by corporate interests, as we have already seen in the EU. We have already seen in the US. People in both the EU and the US are left practically powerless, and the consequence is the rise of right-wing extremism. Varoufakis asks for more openness, democracy. Well, I guess he asks that we reintroduce democracy, and more cooperation in the EU. I share these values, but I believe that the cooperation has to be between autonomous, democratic nation-states, and that the future of the Greek people would have been better secured with a Grexit. The experience from Norway tells me that this is the best chance we have of securing that the power is with the people. Thank you.
We have a fantastic graduate program here. You should sign up. Thank you, Ebba. Our next speaker is our newest faculty member, Mark Setterfield. He's a professor at the New School, and he's also on faculty at our wonderful undergraduate school, the Lang College, Eugene Lang College. Before joining the New School, we really stole him from Trinity College. He was the Maloney Family Distinguished Professor of Economics. He held a visiting position at the University of Massachusetts, Downing College, Dalhousie University, the University of Paris, and the University of Sao Paulo. He is an associate member of the Cambridge Center for Economic and Public Policy at Cambridge University in England, and a senior research associate at the International Economic Policy Institute at Laurentine University. He's a member of the Economic Center at the University of Paris. His research focuses on macroeconomics, growth and distribution, and post-Keynesian economics. Please welcome Professor Mark Setterfield.
Thank you. Okay, I've got pretty pictures as well. So, okay, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky, and I'm going to shift the discussion into, let's call it the mid-Atlantic here. What I want to suggest is that there are some uncomfortable parallels to be drawn between recent developments in Europe and very contemporary and potential future developments in the US. So to begin, I'm going to borrow Yanis's time machine. But instead of taking you back to ancient Greece, I'm just going to go back to the UK in the late 90s, almost as bad a place as Athens. So the conceit then, and in fact it's still a conceit now, is that the debate over all things European was just some simple kind of bipolar opposition between a right-minded pro-European cultural elite on the one hand, and a sort of knuckle-dragging Neanderthal xenophobic bunch of little Englanders, as I've called it, them here. Wear your Union Jack vest and measure everything in pounds and ounces. That wasn't a correct characterization of the debate then, and it isn't now. There always was, and there still is, a pro-European right who really just can't wait to get their hands on cheap East European labor. And at the same time, there was in the late 90s and still is a Eurosceptic, a modern Eurosceptic left. And these are critics not of Europe per se, but of the institutions of the European project. The left Eurosceptic view is what I've called here a view of Europe as a sort of institutionalized failure by design. A central bank in the form of the European Central Bank, of course, that has institutionalized monetarism, and then a series of monetary and fiscal arrangements that, together institutionalize austerity. So the prediction in the late 90s from this group was that the minute that the private sector failed to spontaneously generate a buoyant economy, as is its wont, that the wheels would come off. And I would argue that that prediction was, or has been actually borne out by events since then. Now, the solution. Yeah, trust the British to lower the tone of the debate. I know. We'll come to that in a second. The solution to this is, in principle, quite easy. Jamie Galbraith turned up in Europe about 15 years ago and said, look, all you need to do, Europeans, is become more like America. So let's just pause to reflect on that. An American turns up in Europe and tells the Europeans they need to be more American. Zut alors, right? No, but in fact, Jamie was right, and all he was really doing was channeling the spirit of Jacques Delors. What he was arguing really was that to make a unified Europe work, you needed proper economic institutions, a central bank that actually looks like a central bank, that acts like a government banker, and doesn't impose the same kind of essentially cash flow limits on the central government that you would expect to find in private households and businesses. And then some form of fiscal federalism, a proper system of taxes and transfers, exactly the kind of institutions that you find in this continental economy here. Of course, you're not going to please all the people all the time, and this is the newspaper headline in 1988 from The Sun. Those of you who are not familiar with British culture, let's just say that that symbol is not welcoming. So what does any of this have to do with the US right now? Well, I would argue quite a lot. What I've done here is I've superimposed current US political debate on what I previously characterized as debate about Europe and the European Union. And I think the important things to note here are this, that if you look at the top row, the establishment of both parties is unified in the sense that they are architects and or stewards of neoliberalism. What that means then, if we look at the left column, is that the left has essentially vacated the bottom left square. And really it's taken a fringe candidate, Bernie Sanders, to try to sort of blow onto the embers of what's left in that bottom left square. The problem is that when you vacate that bottom left square and when economic times turn hard, you invite the mass population of the bottom right square. And that, in a nutshell, I think, is the problem everywhere right now. So, in line with colleagues like Tom Pally in Washington, Jerry Friedman at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, I actually think that this is a crucial electoral cycle in the US for the Democrats. First of all, this is because the working class here is divided. Older workers, victims of trade agreements, and 35, 40 years of real wage stagnation have gravitated towards Trump. Younger workers, however, meanwhile, who are struggling with excessive student loan debt in the housing market and the lack of anything in the job market that resembles a career, have gravitated towards Sanders. And what I would suggest is that really the Democrats need to reunite the two. And what I mean by that is not that the Democrats need to do that for their own political purposes. It's not clear to me that they do, but rather they need to do it for the good of the country. Here's why. So I think the Democrats then have a choice. They can turn towards their social democratic New Deal roots on the one hand, or they can basically keep putting lipstick on the pig, right? They can go for another 4 years of Age of Diminished Expectations. That's the title of a book by Paul Krugman, apologism for what's been going on for the best part of 30 years. My fear is that politically, the Democrats are going to be tempted to pursue the second strategy. Why so? Well, the Republicans have already vacated the center. You've got Bill Clinton on board, the arch political pragmatist. Put 2 and 2 together and you get 4. The Democrats, after the convention, tack towards the right. And, well, I would argue that the country actually can't afford that. Specifically, it effectively can't afford a 5th Bill Clinton administration at this juncture. First of all, Sanders, Trump, whatever you think of them as individuals, much less as prospective heads of state, have uncovered, I think, a visceral discontent with the state of the economy that, in my opinion, is actually quite fully justified. And I think at this point, failure to take that seriously could really spell disaster. If there is a proper populist right-wing politician in the US who is paying attention to what's happening right now, then I think they will sort of see, well, you know, okay, Trump doesn't really know what he's doing, but if you do this properly, then there's an opportunity in 4 years' time, or if not in 4 years' time, in 8 years' time. And just in case you think that that is the sort of wild imaginings of a European who is too immersed in interwar European history, well, never mind interwar European history. Let's go back to Europe and just look at the last 15 or 16 years. The rise of the Le Penists in France, and of course the emergence and electoral success in the last cycle of the so-called UK Independence Party. So at the end of the day, then, the take-home is what? What I would suggest then is 2 things. First of all, as I've tried to suggest, I think there are some frankly uncomfortable parallels between developments in the European Union over the last 15 or so years and contemporary developments and possibly future expected developments in the US. And that comparison really comes from a common source. At the end of the day, it emerges from a situation where you get this lethal combination of politics and economics under conditions where, first of all, the economics is just chronically wrong, and secondly, when you systematically ignore the discontent of the losers. Thank you.
Thanks again. All right, you made it. You made it.
I just get my...
Oh, it's okay. Yeah. Hey, thanks a lot. Do I sit down? Okay. Hi. Thanks a lot for your questions. We got a lot, and they're really good ones. I think we'll start with a very simple question.
Okay.
Is there hope? Can Podemos in Spain provide an alternative to the pro-austerity economic policies in Europe?
Well, there is always hope.
Hope.
And hope is a matter of faith. If you try to find empirical evidence to sustain it, you will fail. There is no evidence that one should be hopeful, and therefore, an old Greek communist once said to me that as a Marxist, you must always have a view about everything and always remain hopeful. So that's my religion. Right. On the question of Podemos, I very much hope so. Podemos came out of the Indignados movement, the occupation of central squares, and it would now have been much more powerful if it was not for our ignominious defeat last summer. Our defeat had the explicit purpose of weakening Podemos. The Prime Minister of Spain, Mr. Mariano Rajoy, came out of the session during which my friend and colleague Alexis Tsipras, after our paths parted and he decided to capitulate, he was tortured fiscally waterboarded for 17 hours. And he came out and surrendered. And Rajoy took the surrender document in front of the camera and did this. No, seriously, he did this in front of the cameras, the Spanish media, and said, "This is what you get if you vote for Spain's Syriza."
Oh.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Oh.
And yet he lost the election.
Yeah.
Without Syriza, without Podemos winning it. Right. But having said that, allow me to also nuance my answer. I believe that we've reached a stage now in Europe, and that's where we probably disagree, where political parties that are defined within the space of nation states are simply not capable of providing the local activism and simultaneously the European agenda which is necessary in order to make the local activism coherent. This is why some of us are starting a very utopian project which knows no borders and which tries to mobilize Europeans across Europe, not because we want to deprive the autonomous nation state of its significance, but to enhance it. Because there is a fallacy in Europe at the moment, that if you give more, if you do what Galbraith suggests, if you move towards greater consolidation of the solutions for public debt, for banking, for the humanitarian and the poverty crisis, and the major threats that are common to Europe, that if you do that, you need to reduce the sovereignty of the nation state. This is a very big mistake. It's not a zero-sum game. At the moment, my former colleagues in government in Athens are in government but not in power. Taking a holistic approach to the problem of debt in Europe, a holistic approach to the problem of very low aggregate investment, would give nation-state governments, regional governments, municipalities more degrees of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Oh, mm-hmm. Right. So this question is from a 13-year-old in the audience. Right. His family comes from Greece, Athens, and Limnos.
That's a mistake.
Yeah. A lot of people come from there, right?
Yeah, it's a mistake.
So he asks, or she, what is the chance that the average Greek will have a better life quality in 10 years than the hard life they have now? Well, this is from Jason.
Well, Jason, the answer depends on what we actually do, on our praxis, on our actions. It's not like predicting the weather. The weather is serene, majestic, doesn't give a damn about our predictions regarding its ways. But our social reality depends on what we actually do, on our belief, on our faith, degree of hope, and our capacity and readiness to organize, to act, to say no to misanthropic and inefficient policies.
Yeah, yeah. Good. So at the beginning of the Greek crisis, why didn't the Syriza government seriously cut the military budget? A budget that seemed totally out of proportion given that both Greece and Turkey are NATO members.
Well, we did cut it. I cut by 250 million in the first few months.
Is that a lot?
It's a reasonable amount. Okay. I remember that most of the, you've got to understand that when you move into government, you have very few degrees of freedom compared to the ones you think you have. One of the reasons is that there are legally active contracts which you need to honor, and these require, it will take a long time to unwind these contracts. So indeed, we had 10, 15-year long contracts regarding purchases, repurchases, stockpiling, and within those confines, that was game. But let me put it this way. The bankruptcy of the Greek state that we inherited was so deep and so irreversible that even if we cut down the whole of the military budget, zero, if we went Costa Rica, right, and we just fired everyone and honored no contract, it would make no difference. We owed 321 billion when our GDP was 178 billion. And we have a wonderful arrangement in Europe where we have a large central bank without a state and states like ours without central banks. So add to that this gargantuan debt and you have your answer.
Yeah, all right, okay. Here's a short question, or it's a statement. Donald Trump.
Well,
we're so eloquent here at
the expression of enhanced alienation of the American lower middle class.
Yeah, so you see it there.
That's a dictionary definition.
That's it. Mark? Donald Trump?
I can't add to the definition. Because,
you can give your own.
Well, I think, though, that it's worth emphasizing that, there is always hope. And I think primarily there are a lot of good economic ideas. Well, I should know that, right? We're a repository of all of them here at the New School. But no, seriously, though, I think that there are some economic ideas here that could actually improve things not just locally within individual nations in the EU, but in the whole. The obstacles are, I think, largely political, and I don't say that to sort of underestimate them. I think, on the contrary, those are probably the most formidable
the technical issues, fixable in a week.
Yeah.
In a week.
So again, there are a lot of questions here about Greece. So this is pretty typical. This comes from a student in our sociology department. How do you tackle one of Greece's main challenges? And here he identifies it as a low productivity. How do you increase Greece's productivity and reduce the dependency on EU funding? So, two-part question.
It's very simple, one word, investment.
Investment by whom?
Investment. It doesn't matter by whom. We need investment. We have extremely high-quality human capital.
Yeah.
We have pretty good resources in terms of, a lot of sun for solar energy. No, don't laugh. It's a very important resource these days, especially given the developments in renewable energies. We have a lot of wind, we have a lot of waves, and we have a lot of sun. It's not unimportant. But primarily, the human capital. Our young people who are now emigrating, and this is a permanent loss, or it becomes permanent after they stay out of the country for 4 to 5 years, more or less. The reason why we have low productivity is because we have, look, let me put it in an American context. Greece had a mini industrial revolution that began in the 30s. It was interrupted by war, civil war and all that, and then took off in the early 1950s because of Marshall Plan aid. It was a small industrial revolution, but a substantial one by Greek standards. Unfortunately, it was done in the context of a post-Civil War, utterly authoritarian, fascistic almost state, with a great deal of nepotism. The same family had one minister in the government, the other one was an industrialist, the third one was a professor at the University of Athens, usually. I'm not exaggerating. And there was a lot of protectionism. So when two things happened after the Nixon shock, one was the oil price boom, and secondly, the end of the Greek dictatorship and the beginning of the process for getting Greece into the European Common Market, which then became the European Union. In other words, the removal of barriers of trade and tariffs and quotas. So you had a boost in energy costs in an inefficient industry, and at the same time removal of protection. So suddenly, this industry died. You know, at that point, Greece had the lowest level of debt in Europe,
Yeah, right.
both public and private. And what happened was the losses of the private sector, surprise, surprise, were taken over by the state in the form, because we didn't have unemployment benefit, we didn't have any social security. So there was a lot of political pressure to shift those people from the crumbling industries, private industries, onto the public sector. Public sector got bloated, and so on and so forth. So that we had a spurt of investment in the 1950s and 60s that died with the end of Bretton Woods. We have not had a recovery. All we had was Ponzi growth using EU resources. What did Greece offer the EU? Why did the EU want Greece in?
Yeah.
We didn't have natural resources in the form of oil and gold and all that. What we had was the low level of indebtedness. We were an ideal customer for German and French banks because Greeks outright owned their homes. Nobody had mortgages, nobody had credit cards, nobody had personal loans. And they were almost Protestant in avoiding indebtedness, debt.
Yeah.
And this is a godsend for a Frankfurt banker awash with cash, trying to find somebody to lend it to who has collateral and a good credit history.
Oh, that's great.
So this is what we brought,
That's
our capacity to become indebted. This is what we offer the European Union. And lo and behold, we did manage it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Great. Ebba, there's a stark contrast to the Norwegian housing market. How does that connect?
Yeah, I was actually just going to give a comment about the productivity.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, you know, first a very short comment that, of course, yeah, Greece has to do many things to increase the productivity. And you know, in Norway, what has been very effective is the very strong unionization, because you have local people at work, but you have more work democracy, and they're easier for people in the workplace to tell, like, what's wrong here, what can we do to make this, the more worker participation, and that has really helped. But I think one thing is just, you know, you have to look at what Greece can do to increase their productivity, but also, like, a very important part of Greece increasing their exports is that, I mean, Germany has to increase their wages in Germany. It's interesting. I mean, it was it was Keynes after the war. It was, you know, so clear, saying so precisely that the only thing that could help Germany then was if we had to let Germany increase their export surplus, and that's the same. The surplus countries have to make adjustments to let the deficit countries increase their exports. It has to happen many ways.
Yeah. Well, on that point about integrating the economies rather than separate them, Gillian Tett from the Financial Times had something that might be laughable, but she was desperate for ideas, and she reported that perhaps the Greeks, with their large pensions and growing population
Greeks
of
don't
pensioners.
have large pensions.
Well, but they
myth.
do have a deficit, unlike the moon with oxygen. They do have a deficit of sunlight. Of sunlight. So couldn't the Greeks actually arrange for their pensioners? I mean, the Germans to arrange for their pensioners to go to Greece, and Greece could export home care.
Yeah, but you know, you only have to state this to realize the poverty of ideas.
Exactly.
The complete poverty of ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so tell me.
The solutions are really simple for the Eurozone as a whole. What we need to do is we need to simulate a federation. We don't need a federation now. We can't have a federation now. Because now we're in a political process of disintegration, of centrifugal forces that are tearing us apart. The Germans hate the Greeks hate the Germans, everybody hates the French. It just, you know, the Scots want to get out of England, the English want to get out of Europe. So the whole thing is fragmenting, deconstructing. Stabilization is what we need. And stabilization in 4 areas. Firstly, public debt. Secondly, aggregate investment. Thirdly, banks. We have a banking union that is confirmed in the breach, yeah, not in reality, only in name. And of course, now we have a poverty crisis, which is not just in Greece. It's in parts of Germany, and it's in parts of the rich north. And this gives rise to various ugly forces that are coming through the woodwork. And this we can do using existing institutions, just redeploying them, even within the current terrible European Union treaties. As we were saying before, the technical solutions are very simple. We can discuss them. I don't want to bore people now. The question is, why is the political process so inimical to this getting together? And it all boils down to 19th century power relations. It is brutish, it is vulgar, and it is simple. And let me, if I may, let me give you one very simple example. I was in a conversation with one of Mrs. Merkel's advisors. And this was a confidential conversation. It's still coming. I haven't told you what his name is. See, Larry Summers was
know.
right. I was not cut out to be an insider. No, but this is he made a very important point, which informs this. I was making a particular proposal, which I have worked with Jamie, and been working now for years with Stuart Holland. We call it the modest proposal, named it after Jonathan Swift, just for a bit of humor there. And we've worked on it for ages now. I'm convinced that it would work if it was applied. Of course, not everybody's convinced. And here is Merkel's advisor complimenting me, saying this is a great idea. I said, wow. So are you going to convince Angela? He said, no. I said, why not? She will never be convinced. I said, why not? And his answer was brilliant, and I had not thought of it. He said, listen, when the European Union meets, the European Union Council meets, and she walks in there, and the French president comes, whoever the French president might be, the French president keeps his mouth shut when Merkel speaks. Why? France is a deficit country, Germany is a surplus country. If the euro breaks up, France will go to the Stone Age because all its capital will shift to Germany in anticipation of the revaluation of the new Deutschmark, whereas Germany will be okay. It will have a problem with the overvalued currency, but it will not suddenly lose all its capital like France will. So the German chancellor, when she goes into these meetings, in her handbag, she has an exit card, a get out of Europe card. She doesn't want to use it because she doesn't. It's too lucrative for her to have the low value of the euro for the net exports of Germany. But she has a get out of here card, which she loves to have because the French president doesn't have. And this asymmetrical property right gives her the opportunity to speak when he keeps his mouth shut. And then he said to me, your proposal is great, and it's legal, and we could do it today without treaty change, blah, blah, blah. But it would mean that there would be a new setup. I'm not going to give you the technical reasons, ECB bonds, which we were proposing, and so on and so forth, that prevent anyone from leaving the European Monetary Union after that. So suddenly, it will be the equivalent of her taking out of her handbag that get out of here card and tearing it up, which would then open the mouth of the French president. And it's not that she's power hungry and she wants to have this power for herself. No, she has a Lutheran commitment, a moral commitment to not diminishing the office of Chancellor of Germany. And this is the political problem that we have, not the absence of technical solutions.
Well, speaking of the leverage to leave, would you like to comment on Brexit?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I campaign in Britain all the time. I'm going back. I have a meeting with, we'll be on stage with Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and Caroline Lucas and good people from the SNP and Plaid Cymru even, to campaign for along the lines of the following line, which is our DM's position on this. The British must reclaim their democracy by staying in the European Union to fight against the democratic vacuum in Brussels.
Professor Setterfield, on Brexit.
Well, Yeah, I always, I have some sympathy for what Ebba was saying, because I always find myself sympathizing with groups who find themselves on the wrong side of the power deficit, which I think, you've quite rightly characterized there as, you've either got a credible threat or you haven't, and if you haven't, it's very difficult to engineer change. So, whether it's the Scots within the UK, for example, or even the Quebecois within Canada, I do have some sympathy for those groups, but at the same time, I always want those unions effectively to stay together. So, at the end of the day, I don't want Britain to leave Europe, but at the same time, I'm not sure what positive role Britain will actually play.
Well, it depends on what government has.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah?
But that's why I'm
David Cameron will play no role at all.
Right. Right. And then the question becomes, what is the prospect of the sort of government in Britain that would play a positive role? Because, and that's where I have, again, less confidence in any quick and easy emergence of political solutions to what we agree are essentially a sort of political problem. Which is troubling, because then we're just stuck in the economic morass. And I do think that the dynamics of that, the interaction of the economic morass and the politics, are potentially treacherous, if that's just allowed to continue to drift.
If I may add a point here.
Yeah.
Now, on your position with Norway, I think it's a sound position, and I would support it. I campaigned in my youth against Greece's entry into the European Common Market. That was in the 1970s. Then in the 1990s, I campaigned against entering in the Eurozone. And I'm not changing my mind. I'm not apologizing for this. This was the right campaign. If you're outside, stay outside. But if you've entered, getting out will not take you to where you would have been had you not entered. It's a question of statics and dynamics. I would much rather we had stayed out. But once we're in, we have to fight the corner. Now, in the case of Britain and Brexit, by the way, I was in favor of the Scottish referendum to lead to Scotics.
Only if they take the north of England.
I made it up. Yeah? But and there I disagreed with Alex Salmond on that, what I consider an incoherent policy of wanting to get out but keep the pound sterling. That was a major mistake, but that's another discussion.
Yeah.
So I'm sympathetic too. But on the question of Brexit, the reason why I would oppose it if I were a British voter, and the reason why I campaign in Britain against Brexit is twofold. Firstly, the notion that you're going to reclaim your sovereignty by getting out while staying in the single market and allowing Brussels to decide industry standards, labor protection standards, and environmental protection standards is absurd. Effectively, you give jurisdiction and sovereignty on all those matters to an alien force from which you are withdrawing, and you let them decide in your absence. And that's a problem with Norway. You are not really out. You're in the single market, so you have forfeited sovereignty to an alien force. This is not exactly an act of independence. Now, and the second reason why I'm against Brexit is because, at the moment, looking at both sides of politics, of the argument, the Leave campaign and the Remain campaign, they behave as if the European Union is a given out there, a club. It's like a golf club. Do we want to be a member of it or not? But it's given. Whether we are a member of it or not, it will be there. It's not given. It is disintegrating. And Brexit would speed up the disintegration, and that disintegration would create developments that would be detrimental to Britain, and therefore, this is what I refer to as the Hotel California dictum. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
It's true. Norway is definitely not 100% independent in this situation, but we're definitely more independent. Definitely have a lot more independence than the countries in the EU.
Only because you have a large, fat welfare fund built up from all this fat olive oil.
That's your fat.
See, you can get the boy out of Greece, but not Greece out of the boy. All these oil revenues that you have that are allowing you to have this independence. If Greece had this fat bank account, I can assure you, would be slightly more independent than we are.
Absolutely, and it's definitely a lot more easier to say that we want to stay out of the EU than to say that to exit. I absolutely agree, and to talk about an exit from the EU, it's talking about really to choose between two catastrophes, even if you stay or if you leave. So the question, and that's sort of the starting point. Also, I guess I would say also for Britain right now. But for me, the most important question is the political alienation, that people feel so powerless. I mean, I guess for the US, people are sort of used to the power being far away in Washington. I think in Europe, we were used to actually having democratic power over our nation states, and it mattered. And now you just have more and more the feeling that it doesn't. And that political crisis that is causing a wave of nationalistic and right-wing extremism, and making it impossible for, as you showed, for Greece, impossible for any left-wing governments to do anything differently. I feel like that is...
But you know what? The narrative of let's retreat to the bosom of the nation state only feeds the ultra-nationalists in the end. It does not feed a progressive polity. It does not feed into progressive politics. It is important to maintain an internationalist agenda.
So people really want to know about Greece, and we only have a few more minutes. So I'm going to ask you kind of a list of issues about Greece, but will you leave some time to answer our student from Palestine, Ibrahim's question, about how poor countries may elect a leftist progressive government? How would that come about? He mentions perhaps a full-fledged economic decline would cause a progressive government. But is there something else?
No, I disagree completely with this.
Can you end with that, and may I ask you these questions
Okay.
about Greece? So it looks like people want you to talk about that innovative idea you had to collect taxes using a different financial system. I like it too, so I'd like to hear about that. Would it have worked? Was it working? Somebody asked, why don't we have a crowdfunding campaign? I think I know who asked that, to save Greece. Some people want to know, right? Everybody else knows. Some people want to know what you, to really articulate your arguments against privatization in Greece. What might that be? And another person asked about the corruption in the government. What the prospects there? But save the Palestinian question later for the last.
Yes, okay. Firstly, on privatization. When I was asked by various officials in Brussels, in Frankfurt, in Washington, are you in favor or against privatization? My answer was, which one? And under what circumstances? And what are you offering me?
Yeah, really.
Okay, so let's not be completely blanket ideological here. There are some privatizations that make sense. And there are others but in Greece at the moment, privatization is a land grab. Privatization is obscene. You take all the public assets of a state, you put them in a bucket, and then you appoint, the creditors appoint a president, a CEO for that bucket company, and they do fire sales, getting rid of the silverware of the family at ridiculously low prices, and take that little money to throw it into the bottomless pit of unsustainable debt. That is a crime against logic, and this is worse than a crime against humanity.
That's very good.
On the question of the tax system, well, look, it was, I don't have much time, so let me put it very briefly. I knew from 2012, the moment we were elected, if we were elected, that the troika of lenders, the Eurogroup, would threaten to shut down our banks, which is exactly what they did on day 3. They didn't wait for a week even. And so we had to have contingency plans. And the contingency plan had to involve a system by which to allow for transactions to take place even after your banking system has been closed down. So the idea was to create surreptitiously, without making a big song and dance in advance, to create reserve accounts per tax file number. And let's say that I owe you $1,000 because I can't pay you. You're a pensioner, you are a supplier to the government, whatever. I can simply type this in, give you a PIN number, and allow you to pay somebody else who owes money to the state, who needs to repay tax. And eventually, to develop even applications on smartphones that allow you to do this. And we were very close to achieving this. But that was it was not only a mechanism by which a parallel payment system, euro-denominated, in euros, it wasn't a different currency, but it was meant also as something that we should have to provide us with fiscal space even after a successful negotiation with the Troika. Because imagine a situation where this system is up and running, it is already utilized by a number of people, and then you say to those whom are not owed money by the state, if you want some of these numbers to appear on your reserve account, why don't you give me some of your cash and I'll give you those numbers? Why would they do it? Because you could say to them that this is digital money, so it can be time-stamped and we can have an arrangement. If you give me 1,000 of your real euros and I put 1,000 of my zeros and ones into this reserve account, if you keep this for a year, I'll give you 10% off your extinguishing of taxes. So effectively, I give you a very large return for having lent money to the state. So this is peer-to-peer lending of the state to the state by citizens, bypassing bond markets and the banking system with its T-bills. So this is something I think France should have, Italy should have. In our case, it was a first line of defense against the threat of bank closures, but it was much more than that. It was a way of competing with the banks for transactions.
Has anyone from Italy talked to you about this?
Yes.
Yes.
But you know, in the Mediterranean, there's a lot of talk and very little action.
And not enough whiskey, perhaps.
And finally, what else was there before?
Well, the
question?
crowdfunding.
Crowdfunding? No, we don't want crowdfunding. Because Greece has an unsustainable debt. The problem with Germany was not that Germany and the Slovaks and the Portuguese, all those who contributed to Greece's bailout, did not give Greece enough money. The problem was that they gave too much.
Too much money.
And the money went all to the banks.
Yes.
And now we have an answer, this bottomless pit. We don't want to fill it in with your good money. We want to have a debt restructure that makes sense and which returns to the creditors a lot more than they deserve.
Yeah.
And finally, the point to the
progressive
Palestinian.
governments in poor country.
Progressive governments have elected, poor countries have elected progressive governments again and again and again in history. But my understanding of political processes and economic processes is that during a period of heavy, serious recession, these are not periods that are revolutionary. These periods breed monsters. They breed the Le Pens, they breed the UKIPs, the Golden Daws, the Orhans in Hungary. This is why I very much fear the process of disintegrating the European Union. This is why I'm not in favor of disintegrating a European Union that I fought during my youth not to be part of.
Yes.
Because its disintegration will create a postmodern 1930s, and we know what grew out of it. Just look at Europe today. We have the beginnings of this slide into a postmodern abyss of the 1930s variety, and that will not produce progressive politics.
Right, okay. Anything else, Mike? What do you...
Yes, stabilization that comes from a groundswell of political activism that imposes upon Europe a Green New Deal.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Yanis's book is being sold in the lobby. Thank you so much for coming. This was recorded. It'll live on our website. Thanks very much. See you next year.